Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get unbound.
This episode contains graphic descriptions of domestic violence and medical trauma. Please listen with care and step away if you need to. Your well-being matters more than any story. Before I read this chapter, I want to prepare you for something heavier and more intimate than anything I've shared so far this season, or ever. It's the most vulnerable I think I will ever be in my life, this moment. This isn't just a memory. It's a chapter that shaped entire decades of my life in ways I didn't understand until much later. It's also the reason Nate still says to this day, our roots will always be tangled. It's about fear and love and impossible choices. It's about the night that I died, but nobody knew it because I just got up and showered and carried on with what was left of my life the next day. It's about what happens when you're too young for any of it, but somehow living it anyway. And it's about a loss that has remained with me quietly, privately, for over 32 years now. I'm going to read it now exactly as it was written. If I get emotional, please understand. All I hope for in sharing this is understanding and kindness. Always, please. Chapter 8. The loss. There are some stories that live in your body before they live in your words. Some truths that exist in the space between what happened and what you can bear to remember. Some traumas so complete, so devastating that they fracture not just your sense of safety, but your very sense of reality. New Year's Eve 1993 was one of those stories, and I have decided I will attempt to tell the full story in this chapter. I've spent 30 years trying to find the words for what Brandon took from me that night. 30 years doing on and off therapy, healing circles, and conversations with people who understand what it means to have your entire world shattered in a few hours. What I can tell you is this: Brandon didn't just rape me that night. He murdered my son. That's what I call it, even though no law ever recognized it that way. Even though there was never justice, never accountability, never even an investigation. It's the word Nate and I use between ourselves. Our private truth that the legal system would never validate. To the world, it was just a tragic loss. An early stillbirth with no perpetrator, no crime, no one to hold responsible. But we know what it was, because I was pregnant when he raped me, with Nate's baby. The baby I'd been too scared to tell most people about, too terrified of Brandon's threats to seek proper medical care for, too convinced that somehow I could protect this tiny life by keeping it secret, just like I tried to protect everyone else I loved. The baby I lost 5 hours after Brandon was done with me. His name was Kier. He was born still on January 1st, 1994, at 3:17 in the morning, in a hospital room where I lied to doctors about how the labor had started, where I told them I'd fallen down the stairs, where I protected my abuser one final time because I didn't know how to stop. He was perfect, tiny, even a bit chubby, beautiful, completely formed. The kind of perfect that makes you understand how precious life is and how easily it can be taken away. We held him for exactly 153 minutes before they took him away. And in that time, with a hospital photographer capturing moments we'd never got to repeat, I said goodbye to more than just my son. I said goodbye to the girl who'd believed that love could protect you from the worst things in the world. To the person who thought that if you were careful enough, quiet enough, compliant enough, you could somehow prevent the unthinkable from happening. I said goodbye to hope. I'd known I was pregnant since late summer of 1993, not because I'd taken a test or seen a doctor, but because my body told me in ways that were impossible to ignore. The nausea that wasn't quite morning sickness because it lasted all day, the exhaustion the sleep couldn't touch, the way certain smells made me gag, certain foods made my stomach revolt. I was on the pill and had been for a couple of years, but I still knew. I knew that once more something had failed me. But mostly, I knew because of the fear. The moment I knew for certain, I was alone in the bathroom staring at a pregnancy test I'd bought 3 towns over so no one would recognize me. 2 pink lines that changed everything. I sat on that bathroom floor for an hour, crying so quietly I could barely hear myself. One hand on my stomach, already loving something I was terrified to want. This baby was both everything I'd never dared to dream of and the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to me. My entire life had become this elaborate web of lies, each one protecting a different truth, each one tangling with the others, until I could barely keep track of what was real anymore. Earlier that summer, before I even knew I was pregnant, I'd gotten myself twisted up in one of the most absurd situations yet. I'd needed a fake boyfriend for some friends. Don't ask me why. The reasons made sense at the time in the complicated logic of self-protection I'd developed. The guy everyone thought I was dating was actually dating a girl I knew from school, but he was willing to play along for an evening. A friend of mine got dragged into it too, a double date where neither couple was actually real. She didn't know I wasn't really with this guy, and because she didn't want his friend to think there was any possibility of a real connection, she decided to introduce herself as Bobby Joe. We spent an entire evening maintaining these fictional identities, me pretending to be in a relationship I wasn't in, her pretending to be someone she wasn't, both of us performing normalcy while hiding completely different truths. It would have been funny if it wasn't so fucking sad. This was my life in the summer of 1993. Elaborate performances, careful choreography, making sure no one ever saw the real story because the real story would put people in danger. And then I got pregnant, and the stakes of all those lies got infinitely higher. The bone-deep primal terror that comes with carrying something precious in a world that's shown you how quickly precious things can be destroyed. I'd started gaining more weight deliberately, wearing baggier clothes, anything to hide the changes in my body. I stopped letting my mom hug me because I was afraid she'd feel the difference, afraid she'd ask questions I couldn't answer. Because how could I explain that I was pregnant with Nate's baby, but too terrified of Brandon's threats to tell my family? How could I admit that I was bringing a child into a world where someone had promised to hurt anyone I loved? I had told Nate, though. I had to. As the pregnancy progressed, as my fear grew, as Brandon's threats became more specific and more violent, I realized I couldn't keep this from him. I told him on an unusually warm afternoon in October, in his apartment, sitting on the couch, where we had watched 100 movies together. We had just returned from a nice walk, and he had started some schoolwork. "I need to tell you something," I said, and my voice shook so badly I could barely get the words out. Nate put down his textbook immediately, giving me his full attention the way he always did. "What's wrong?" "I'm pregnant." The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I watched his face cycle through surprise, confusion, and then joy, pure unfiltered joy. "We're having a baby?" he said, and his voice cracked on the word baby. "Yes, but we're having a baby?" He pulled me into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "Beth, this is amazing." "Nate, wait. There's more." And then I told him everything. About Brandon, about the years of threats and manipulation and violence, about why I'd been lying to everyone, hiding everything, living in constant terror. I watched the joy on his face transform into something darker. Rage at what had been done to me, guilt that he hadn't known, fear for what might still happen. "We'll figure this out," he said when I was done, holding me while I cried. "I'll keep you safe. I'll keep both of you safe." He believed it when he said it. So did I. Nate was over the moon about the baby, scared about the Brandon situation, but absolutely ecstatic about becoming a father. He'd talk to my belly when we were alone and tell her baby about all the things they'd do together, all the places they'd go. He understood why I wanted to keep the pregnancy secret. My mom was working at the church, and an unwed teenage mother of a daughter would have been scandalous. We agreed we'd figure out how to tell our families in the new year, after we'd had more time to plan. Little did I know, Nate spilled the beans to his parents almost immediately. He was that happy, and I guess he deserved to share that with someone other than me. But there was another kind of first, one I had experienced completely alone. It was late fall, maybe November. My dad worked for Ford, and he'd brought home a pre-launch Windstar to test drive. He invited my sister and me and a woman he worked with to come along, just to drive around and see how it handled. I was in the back seat with my sister. We'd been getting a little closer around that time. Not like we used to before all the secrets, but closer than we'd been in years. I could feel her trying to reach me, trying to understand what was going on with me, even though I couldn't tell her. That's when I felt it. Not the flutters I'd been dismissing as digestion, but a real kick. Unmistakable, definite. My baby moving inside me, announcing his presence, demanding to be acknowledged. My hand went to my stomach instinctively, and then I pulled it away just as fast, looking around to see if anyone had noticed. My dad was talking to his coworker about the handling. My sister was looking out the window. No one was paying attention to me. I was experiencing one of the most profound moments of my life, the first time I felt my baby move, and I couldn't tell a single person in that car. I wanted to tell my sister so badly I could taste it. I wanted to grab her hand and put it on my stomach and say, "Do you feel that? That's your niece or nephew. That's a whole new person." I wanted to see her face light up with excitement instead of confusion about why I'd been so distant. But I didn't know how. And part of me thought she wouldn't even believe me. She knew about too many of my tall tales, the elaborate stories I'd been telling for years. Why would she believe this one was real? So I sat there in the back of that minivan feeling my baby move, surrounded by family, completely alone with the truth. I was so happy and so incredibly sad. That was what my life had become. Moments of joy experienced in isolation, love that had to be hidden, truth that was too dangerous to speak. By late November, I could feel the baby moving regularly. Little flutters at first, like butterflies or bubbles, and then stronger movements that would take my breath away. Nate would put his hand on my stomach and wait, patient and reverent, until he felt a kick. The first time it happened, he looked at me with tears in his eyes. "That's our baby," he whispered. "That's really him." We'd started calling the baby Kier after Nate's grandfather, though we hadn't told anyone yet. It was our secret name for our secret hope. We didn't know for sure it was a boy, but we both felt like it was. By Christmas, though, it was getting harder to hide. My stomach was taking on a different shape and firmness, and I was showing more, despite the baggy clothes and deliberate weight gain. Nate was so excited he could barely contain himself. I'd catch him grinning at nothing, already planning for a future as a family. "We'll figure this out," he'd say, holding me while I worried about Brandon's threats. "We'll keep you safe. We'll keep the baby safe." He loved me extra during these months, if that was even possible. Protective and gentle and so hopeful about our future together. But even with Nate's love and support, I still lived in constant terror of what Brandon might do. I made up more stories about appointments that were actually prenatal visits paid for with babysitting money. I researched pregnancy and childbirth in library books I was too embarrassed to check out. I planned for a future I wasn't sure I'd live to see. And I fell in love with this tiny life growing inside me, despite being terrified of what Brandon would do if he found out. I used to talk to the baby when I was alone, usually late at night when the house was quiet, and I could pretend for a few minutes that we were safe. I'd tell him about Nate, about how kind and gentle his dad was, about how much we already loved him, even though we'd never met. I'd promise him that somehow, some way, I'd figure out how to protect him from the darkness that had swallowed my life. I'd tell him stories about the life we'd have together, the three of us, when all of this was over. I never got to keep those promises. Brandon found out about the pregnancy on New Year's Eve, 1993. But not the way I'd feared, not through watching or threats or calculated planning. He found out in the worst possible way. I was at that party, that smaller gathering to ring in 1994. Nate was there too, somewhere in the crowd. We'd planned to spend the first moments of the new year together, talking about our future, about the baby we'd tell my family about soon. It was supposed to be the beginning of the best year of our lives. Instead, it became the night everything ended. Brandon was at the party. I don't know how. Maybe he'd been invited. Maybe he'd just shown up. Maybe he'd been watching and waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. I believe it was the latter. When I saw him across the room, my blood went cold, but there were people around, friends, witnesses. I thought I was safe in a crowd. "We need to talk," he said, appearing beside me with that smile that had once made me feel special and now made me want to run. It felt so familiar to that underground parking lot, only this time I felt slightly more confident being in a house full of people. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just for a minute," he said, and there was something in his voice, not quite a threat, but not quite a request either. "Please." People were watching. The music was loud. Everything seemed normal on the surface. So when he gestured toward a quieter room just to talk just for a minute, I followed him. It was the last choice I would make that night. The moment we were alone, he changed. The mask slipped completely, and I saw the rage he'd been carrying, the fury at losing control over me, the hatred at being denied what he thought he owned. It happened so fast I barely understood what was happening. One moment we were standing there, the next I was on the floor, his hands around my throat, his voice in my ear telling me exactly what he thought of my attempts to get away from him. And then he was hitting me, punching my chest, my stomach, my legs, anywhere he could reach, with a kind of methodical violence that was somehow worse than rage would have been. I tried to fight back, tried to scream, but he covered my mouth and nose with his hand, suffocating me, making it impossible to breathe or call for help. The music was too loud and he was too strong and everything was happening too fast. I felt my vision start to darken, that tunnel vision feeling you get when you're about to faint. When I realized the blows to my stomach might hurt the baby, when I felt something inside me shift and tear, when I could barely breathe through his hand clamped over my face, I did the only thing I could think of. When he finally moved his hand and I could gasp for air, I whispered, "Please don't, I'm pregnant." He stopped. For a moment, just a moment, he stopped hitting me and stared. And then something shifted in his face. Not remorse, not shock, but something almost like satisfaction. "Well," he said, his voice conversational, like we were discussing the weather. "That changes things, doesn't it?" What happened after that? The rape, the deliberate brutality, the way he made sure I understood that this was punishment for thinking I could have a life without him. I won't give you those details. What I'll tell you, though, is that when he found out I was pregnant, when I desperately tried to stop him from hitting my stomach, everything changed. The violence became targeted, purposeful, designed not just to hurt me, but to destroy this life growing inside me. He hadn't planned to hurt the baby. He hadn't even known about the baby until then. But once he found out, he made sure there wouldn't be one. It was just after 10 p.m. when he finally finished and left me there. Yeah, I watched the slow flash of a clock on a small table as it slowly crept forward. I don't know how long I lay there after he left. Long enough for the room to stop spinning, long enough to understand that the pain in my abdomen wasn't going away, long enough to convince myself I wasn't going to puke if I stood up, long enough to realize I was bleeding in ways that meant something was very, very wrong. I found a bathroom, stuffed my vagina and underwear with so much toilet paper I could barely walk, trying to stop the bleeding and fluid enough that I could make it through the party without leaving a trail behind me. I had to find Nate. I don't remember much about those minutes, the faces I must have passed, the music that must have been playing, the concerned looks people might have given me. All I remember is the singular focus of finding him, of getting to the one person who could help me. When I found him, when I looked at him and said, "Something's wrong with the baby," I watched his face change. He's not an idiot. He was in med school, and I couldn't hide the other signs of the attack. The marks on my throat, the way I was holding myself, the terror in my eyes. "We need to go," he said immediately. "Now." He got me to his car, drove to the hospital with the kind of controlled urgency that told me he understood exactly how serious this was. The pain was constant, the bleeding wouldn't stop no matter how much toilet paper I'd used, and somewhere deep in my body, I could feel that the baby I'd been protecting for months was slipping away from me. At the hospital, when they asked what happened, I told them I'd fallen down the stairs, that the labor had started spontaneously, that it was just a terrible accident. I had such a hard time lying to Nate. He saw through my shit anyway, but I could lie to everyone else. They believed me because it was easier than asking the questions that might reveal the truth. Of course, now I wonder why they didn't do more. They had to have known. Even Nate doesn't understand why they were not suspicious of my story. Did my injuries line up? The labor was fast and brutal. Nothing like the birth I'd imagined during those secret moments when I'd let myself dream about becoming a mother. Nate held my hand through all of it, whispering encouragement that we both knew was pointless. We weren't bringing a baby home. We were saying goodbye to one. Kier was born just after 3 a.m. on January 1st, 1994. When they placed him in my arms and I saw his perfect, still face, the world stopped. He looked like he was sleeping, like he might open his eyes any moment and see us, his parents, waiting to love him. But he never did. I never saw his eyes open. I never heard his voice cry out for the first time. He weighed 4 pounds, 2 ounces. He had Nate's long fingers and what I imagined was my stubborn chin. He was the most beautiful thing either of us had ever seen, even in death. The nurses brought a tiny basin and showed us how to bathe him. We were so gentle, so careful, like we might hurt him even though there was nothing left to hurt. Nate had secretly bought a onesie weeks prior, light blue, with little faint white elephants on it, and a pair of navy pants. We dressed Kier together, our hands shaking, tears falling on the fabric as we worked. The hospital put a little knit cap on his head. This was the only care we'd ever get to give our son. The only time we'd get to be his parents in any tangible way. Then Nate's parents arrived. They'd known about the pregnancy. Nate had told them everything after I told him. They'd been planning to help us figure out how to tell my family, how to navigate being young parents, how to make it all work. Now they were here to say goodbye to their grandchild. We spent the next 2 hours together, me, Nate, his parents, and Kier. The hospital had called a photographer who came in for situations like this, for babies who would never have school pictures or birthday photos. She took black and white photos, one set for us, capturing the only moments we'd ever have. Nate held Kier and sang softly, some lullaby his mother had sung to him. His voice broke on every other word. His mother cried quietly, holding her son while he held his son. 3 generations of love and loss in one room. His father stood with his hand on my shoulder. This man who barely knew me, but was showing up in the worst moment of my life because I was the mother of his first grandchild. I memorized everything. The light weight of Kier in my arms. The perfect curve of his ears. The tiny fingernails that would never need trimming. The dreams that would never come true. Nate kissed Kier's forehead and told him he loved him. He told him he was sorry he couldn't protect him. He told him he would have been the best dad in the world. And then we had to let the nurses take him away. Those photos lived in a shoebox in my closet for years before I eventually gave them to Nate. I couldn't look at them. Looking hurt too much, but I couldn't get rid of them either. They were the only proof I had that Kier had been real. that Nate and I had been parents, and that our love had created something beautiful, even if we couldn't keep it. Sometimes late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd take the box down and just hold it, not open it. Just hold it and remember that once, for a few hours, I'd been someone's mother. Walking out of that hospital was the hardest thing I'd ever done. People were everywhere. New parents with balloons and flowers, grandparents with cameras, siblings excited to meet new babies. It seemed like the hospital lobby was full of joy we'd never get to experience. It didn't feel like a regular hospital, though it was. It felt like it was all babies, all the time, happy and joyful. Nate had his arm around me, holding me up physically because I couldn't seem to make my legs work properly. His parents walked beside us, carrying the belongings we were given, as well as that elephant onesie Nate brought, but would never take home with a living baby. We'd come in as parents. We were leaving as what? Bereaved parents? Parents of a dead baby? There wasn't even a word for what we were. In the parking lot, Nate helped me into the car and then just stood there for a moment, his hand on the door, staring at nothing. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "I don't know how to just go home, go on, pretend this didn't happen." "We don't pretend," I said. "We just survive, 1 minute at a time." It was the best advice I had. It wasn't nearly enough. I left the hospital on January 1st, physically empty and emotionally shattered beyond recognition. The doctors gave me pamphlets about grief counseling and support groups for women who'd lost babies. They told me to take it easy, to give my body time to heal, to call if I had any complications. They didn't ask about the bruises on me, or the way I flinched when they touched me. They didn't question why an 18-year-old girl had fallen down the stairs on New Year's Eve. They sent me home to figure out how to live with a loss that felt bigger than my ability to contain it. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my friends. But Nate grieved with me, held me through the worst of it, reminded me that it wasn't my fault, even when I couldn't believe him. Nate's parents thought it had been a spontaneous stillbirth, a tragic loss, but not a crime. They didn't know the truth about what Brandon had done, about the attack that had stolen their grandchild. That secret stayed between Nate and me, one more truth too heavy to share. But grief that size can't be contained, even when it's shared. It leaks out in ways you don't expect, in reactions that don't make sense to people who don't know what you're carrying. I became someone I didn't recognize, angry at random moments, crying for no apparent reason, unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to concentrate on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. Nate tried to help, tried to comfort me, tried to remind me that we were in this together, but the guilt was crushing. Not just grief, but the specific, targeted guilt that comes with feeling responsible for someone else's loss. I had brought Brandon into our lives. I had hidden the pregnancy for months out of fear. I had failed to protect our son. And now Nate was suffering because of choices I made. Brandon tried to contact me a couple more times after New Year's Eve. Once in late January, appearing outside a coffee shop where I was meeting a friend, just to remind me that he was still watching. Valentine's Day weekend that year, I finally agreed to go with Nate and a few other friends to a bar in a plaza near my old high school. I felt lighter than I had in a while, and we all left to go to our friend's place across the street from my house, and Brandon appeared. Another attack with a knife that happened so fast I barely understood what was happening. Nate and our friends chased Brandon and waited for police. After that, he seemed to disappear from my life as suddenly as he'd entered it. Whether he'd been locked up, or had finally gotten bored with tormenting me, or scared by how close he'd come to being caught and convicted of everything he did, or satisfied that he'd destroyed me thoroughly enough to last a lifetime, I don't know. What I know was that the immediate danger was over, but the damage had been done. Brandon had spent years systematically destroying my sense of self, my ability to trust my own perceptions, my belief that I deserved love and protection. And then he'd taken my baby. The direct abuse was over, but the real nightmare was just beginning. Because now I had to learn how to live with what he'd done to me. And I had absolutely no idea how to do that. I pushed Nate away. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, steadily, like a tide going out. Every time he tried to get close, I found a reason to create distance. Every time he asked what was wrong, I deflected with lies that became more elaborate and less believable as time went on. That February, he brought me flowers for no reason, just because he knew I loved them. I thanked him and then picked a fight about how he never understood what I needed, how he was suffocating me with his concern. In March, he tried to hold my hand while we were watching TV. I pulled away like his touch burned me. In April, he said, "I love you," and I said, "Okay," instead of saying it back. I watched the confusion in his eyes turn to hurt. I watched the hurt turn to resignation. I was destroying the best thing in my life with surgical precision. "Talk to me," he'd beg. "Please just talk to me. Let me help." But I couldn't, because helping me meant staying close to me, and staying close to me felt dangerous for him. So I kept pushing until he finally stopped reaching. I couldn't bear the kindness in his eyes when he looked at me, because I felt like I was deceiving him just by existing in his presence. I couldn't stand the way he touched me, gently, carefully, like I was something precious, because I felt like damaged goods that would contaminate anything pure they came in contact with. I couldn't tolerate his love because I felt fundamentally unworthy of it. So I sabotaged it, systematically, deliberately, until Nate finally gave up, trying to save someone who seemed determined to drown. One day in May, Nate had come over, trying again to break through the walls I'd built. "I miss you," he said simply. "I miss us. I miss who we were before." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "Maybe that's the problem," I said, and my voice was cold in a way I'd learned from Brandon. "Maybe who we were before doesn't exist anymore. Maybe that person is gone and you need to stop trying to bring her back." "I don't believe that." "Then you're an idiot." He flinched like I'd hit him. "Beth, I don't want to do this anymore," I said. "Whatever this is, I can't. I need you to stop trying to save me." "I'm not trying to save you," he said quietly. "I'm trying to love you." "Well, don't. I don't want it." The look on his face when I said that, devastation mixed with something like relief, like part of him was grateful to finally be released from the impossible task of loving me, would haunt me for years. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay." And he left. I told myself it was for his own good. I told myself I was protecting him. I told myself a lot of lies that night. It was only after he was gone, after I'd successfully destroyed the last good thing in my life, that Nate told his parents the truth about what had really happened on New Year's Eve. About Brandon, about the attack, about how their grandchild had been murdered, even if the law would never call it that. They called me, his mother crying on the phone, saying they wished they'd known, wished they could have helped, wished I hadn't had to carry that alone. But by then it was too late. I'd already pushed everyone away. It wasn't Nate's fault. It wasn't even really my fault. It's what trauma does. It convinces you that you're toxic, that everyone you love would be better off without you, that isolation is protection instead of punishment. I spent the next few years proving Brandon right about everything he'd ever said about me. That I was worthless, that no one could really love me, that I was fundamentally broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. I tortured myself more effectively than he ever had because I used his voice to do it. The abuse was over, but I'd learned his lessons so well that I didn't need him there to continue destroying my life. I was perfectly capable of doing it myself. The girl who'd survived 3.5 years of systematic abuse had finally been defeated. Not by her abuser, but by the voice he'd left behind in her head. And it would take years to learn how to turn the volume down on that voice long enough to remember who she'd been before he taught her to hate herself. But that's a story for another chapter. Okay, so I'm hoping to keep this discussion short. But I have a feeling I might say more than I want. I am frankly quite shocked I mostly kept it together while reading this. I did have to do some breaks in between, but I thought it would be a lot messier because sometimes I can talk about this and just completely lose it. And others, obviously not with everybody, but the people who know. And sometimes I'm okay and I can get through it. So I guess I'm just having a stronger day. I don't know. Anyway, there are chapters in a person's life that don't just sit in the past. They keep unfolding over and over and over in the nervous system, in relationships, in the way you breathe, literally, in the way that you brace without even realizing you're bracing. And chapter 8, this is one of those chapters for me. So what you just heard isn't just a story that every person in my circles knew only bits and pieces of, but now they know everything. It isn't just a story I've avoided telling for over 30 years. It's a story I've carried for 30 years. And that's not the same thing. Carrying something is constant. Carrying something shapes your posture, your capacity, your worldview. Carrying something changes who you become long before you ever have the words to explain why. Some losses are so profound, they change the fundamental structure of who you are. If you've ever lost a child, if you've ever held a baby that you'll never get to raise, damn. If you've ever had to say goodbye to a future you'd imagined with someone who will never grow up, there are no words for that kind of grief. There's no timeline for healing from it. There's no making sense of it, ever. There's only learning to carry it, one breath at a time. That night changed who I was and who I would be forever. Yeah. I gotta sit with that, because this chapter isn't simply about violence. It's not simply about a teenage girl with nowhere safe to go. It's not even just about the loss of a child, which on its own is enough to break a person in ways that language will never fully capture. It's about how trauma fractures reality and it forces you into these impossible choices and it rewrites your identity long before you understand what's even happening. And it's also about something else. The way that grief becomes a companion you never invited, but you can't get rid of because it's tied to someone you love. Someone you loved. This chapter touches on something I think many survivors might recognize, the split between the world you live in publicly and the world you're surviving in privately. The dual existence, the constant vigilance, the secret protectiveness over people who don't even know they need protecting. Abuse doesn't just take away your safety, it rearranges your entire sense of what choices are possible. And pregnancy inside of that, pregnancy under threat, there's a specific type of terror that comes with trying to protect a wee little life inside a body that someone else believes they control. When you're carrying a child in a dangerous situation, your entire world becomes about protection. Every decision, every movement, every breath is calculated around keeping that life safe. If you've ever been pregnant while being abused, if you've ever had to choose between your safety and your child's, if you've ever felt the impossible weight of trying to protect someone who can't protect themselves, that's a kind of strength that most people will never understand. Predators don't just threaten their primary victims. They weaponize everyone you love against you. They make it clear that your resistance will cost other people, that your freedom comes at the expense of their safety. This isn't about loving your abuser. It's about being forced to choose between multiple forms of harm. none of which you deserve. People who haven't lived it often don't understand that this is not about why didn't you tell someone, or why didn't you go to the police, or why didn't the hospital do more? My God, that's a question I still hold today. But I couldn't have answered those questions with clarity back then or even in the decades that followed, but I can now that I've fully processed everything, um, and been in conversation with people who are professionals and who have experienced it, and in using my own education and what I've learned. Survivors live inside a calculus that outsiders can't see, if that makes sense. Every decision is weighed against danger, and every truth is measured against consequences, and every silence is quite literally a survival strategy. And teenagers, especially teenagers who are isolated or manipulated, make the choices that feel less likely to get someone else hurt. And I want to speak to something else here, the grief of secrecy. The grief of loving a baby you can't talk about, the grief of planning a future very, very quietly, the grief of feeling kicks you can't share, the grief of holding hope with one hand and fear with the other. There are so many parts of this story where past me was trying to mother a child and protect an abuser at the same time because she thought that was the only way to keep people safe. That's a type of emotional labor that no teenager should ever have to carry. Nobody should ever have to carry. And then there's the loss itself. Stillbirth is this devastation that most people don't know how to talk about, especially when it happens quietly or privately or outside the expected timeline of adulthood or in circumstances that don't fit the sanitized narratives that people are comfortable with. Losing a child changes you in ways that can't be explained to people who haven't experienced it. It's not just grief, it's the death of every dream you had for that person. Every birthday they'll never have, every milestone they'll never reach. If you've lost a baby or held a child who will never grow up, please know that your grief is valid and your love is real, and that child mattered. They mattered because you loved them. Nothing can change that. When you lose a child you've never gotten to raise, the grief is nonlinear. It's not just sadness, it's identity grief, it's future grief, it's the grief of the life you would have had, the person you would have become, and the family you would have built. It's the grief of a timeline that was stolen. Complicated grief, grief that's tangled with guilt and secrets and trauma is one of the hardest things a human can carry. When you can't share your loss with the people who should be grieving with you, when you have to mourn alone because telling the truth would cause more harm, that isolation becomes another layer of the trauma. Your grief deserves to be witnessed. Your loss deserves to be acknowledged. You don't have to carry it alone forever. And no matter how much time passes, that grief doesn't resolve. It doesn't heal the way people think healing works. It becomes something you integrate, something that you learn to carry without letting it crush you. Like I've often said, the hurt and the pain doesn't go away. You just get used to it. And I think that's how it's been. You become someone who walks with an invisible absence. And I think it's important to say this clearly. A baby who dies is still your baby. Their existence doesn't disappear because their life was short. The love is real. The loss is real. The parenthood is real. You don't stop being a parent just because you don't have a child to raise. For me, telling this story now, it isn't about reopening a wound. That wound has never closed. What I'm doing is finally allowing light and air to reach something that I've kept buried for over 3 decades. Something that deserved recognition long before now. Keir existed. He mattered. He was loved. And his story didn't end in that hospital. It continued in the shape of every version of me that came after. And I want to acknowledge Nate, too, because grief doesn't happen in a vacuum. We were kids. We were kids who were trying to do the right thing and trying to build a little world of safety around someone who was already in danger. or kids who lost their child on the same night they could have lost each other to violence. Those kinds of losses bind people. Not always forever, not always in the ways you'd expect, but they imprint. You don't ever forget the person you held a baby with, no matter how life carries you forward, right? The end of abuse doesn't mean the end of trauma. In many ways, it's when the real work begins. Learning how to trust again, how to form healthy relationships, how to rebuild your sense of self from the ground up. If you've survived abuse, know that getting away from your abuser was just the first step. Healing is a long process and you deserve support every step of the way. Trauma, turning you into your own worst enemy. It convinces you that you're dangerous to the people you love, that isolation is safe. It's safety, it's safer, that you're protecting others by destroying yourself. If you've ever pushed away people who loved you because you felt unworthy of their care, if you've ever sabotaged good things because you believed that you didn't deserve them, that's not your authentic voice. That's your abuser's voice living in your head. You are worthy of love. You deserve care. You are not toxic. You are not broken beyond repair. I got to go back to Nate again because it's something I wanted to mention. Part of me really wishes that more people can understand the relationship I have with Nate today. We have faced so much backlash and judgment, accusations, outright cruelty from friends, and strangers alike, so much so that I refuse to go into detail at all now about what we share now. And it's all because of Cure. Our history, our experiences, our shared trauma, our choices today, and our healing. I wish I could understand how it is that Brian knows Nate as family and treats him and what I have with him with so much respect. Always has. But other people I know don't even offer the same. It's so strange to me. I don't know. Now I know that the only people who really matter when it comes to Nate and me, are me and Nate, and by default, Brian and crew, of course. But it's so weird that, some of the things that have been said about him and me behind our backs in the past. I don't really want to get into it. I don't want to discuss things that have happened between us and individuals and me on social media about 5 years ago. But I know it all. These people don't realize how much I know, but I know it all. And maybe it's just another one of those things that nobody will ever understand unless they've been through it, even if I try to explain the hell out of it. And maybe it's another one of those things that people would rather gossip about than learn a little about from the sources. Sad, really. As I close out this discussion, I want to hold space for anyone listening who's lived something even a little bit similar. If you were ever pregnant while afraid, or if you ever loved a baby you couldn't tell the world about. Maybe you lost a child and felt like you weren't allowed to grieve openly or tell people about that. If you were ever forced to parent your own terror while trying to protect someone smaller and more fragile, I see you. You're not dramatic, you're not weak, you're not broken. You survived an impossible situation using every damn tool you had access to at the time. And if your body remembers more than your words do, that's okay. Trauma often speaks first through the body. You're allowed to reclaim your story at your own pace, even if that pace takes 30 years. Thank you so much for being here for this episode, being here with me. I just, again, want to say, please be kind to people. That's all. I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit author.bethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/unbound podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.